The surfaces need to be as perfect as possible because the eye needs to look past the surface, needs to look through the surface, needs to not see the surface but see the surrounding ambient light in the space, or to see other things in the room. It's all about what these pieces teach you to perceive about their surroundings. But because they are, in many cases, physical objects, the physicality of them is what one tries to erase. I am from Pasadena. I spent a number of years in the East Coast studying art history and returned to become a practicing artist, a painter first and then a sculptor in high-tech materials in the middle 60s. When I came back to California, I reconnected with the entire landscape, which had had a tremendous effect on me and which I missed immensely, particularly the ocean. And I spent a great deal of time at the coast, walking the beaches of my childhood and becoming reacquainted with the life here. And I think I've always been interested in the light, the transparency of the ocean, and the light as it penetrated through water and was reflected from the top of water. And so movement and light had always been a part of my early life. And when I reconnected with that, it was very powerful. And I think that probably led me into the exploration of some of these high-tech aerospace materials, specifically polyester resin. It was a pivotal moment because a group of artists began to work with aerospace materials and some plastics, some highly refined materials that had been declassified, that were clear, that were very seductive for an artist. And the artists began to work with them in a very different manner. They were all young men, and they were all living in Venice. I was living over here in Pasadena. And I saw that we were all working in different ways, but with similar materials. We were all interested in specifically two things. One, transparency. It was all about perception and light. That was the overriding thing. So I made some very small little pieces on my own. The first pieces were a sort of an egg shape. I don't remember how that shape came about. Before that, I made some very tiny spheres, 2 inches. Then I did this egg shape, and in the egg shape, I experimented with the insertion of solid, clear acrylic rods, which created no end of troubles. I was barely learning how to handle the material chemically, and the insertion of the acrylic, which was a different animal altogether, created cracks and fissures and problems. Eventually, because I was working so small, I was able to control that. There was a 2-year residency at Caltech between 1969 and 1971 for artists, one of whom was Peter Alexander. We were working with polyester resin primarily. At the end of that time, there was an exhibit. My particular part included 4 3-foot diameter discs on high pedestals and one very large 5-foot diameter disc. Since I did not know how to make a mold in those days, I just cast a big thick pancake of polyester resin, which must have been hundreds of gallons. When it was finished, since I wanted to make it into a disc, I began working with a very heavy-duty sander and began by standing on top of it and bending down, sanding it until it was in the shape of a disc. Before this disc was shown in the show, the day before, I was sanding it, but I hadn't begun polishing it yet, and Peter Alexander said, "You will never get that done for the show." But he said, "I know someone in Venice who I think could help you. His name is Jack Brogan." I called him and went to visit him, and he then came with me to Caltech with the truck and his men and picked it up and said, "Yes, we can do this," and took it. They worked all night, and they brought it back the morning of the opening of the exhibition and installed it, polished and finished. And so that began a very, very long, many decades long association with Jack Brogan. The disc was in the show for about a week, and then it was stolen. Nobody knows what happened to it. It would have been rather difficult to steal because it took 4 or 5 men to lift it. It was extremely heavy. But it disappeared, never to be, as yet, never to resurface. Ever since this occurred, I've wanted to remake the disc. And so at the moment, I'm engaged in a process of doing just that, this time with a very sophisticated mold conceived and made by Jack Brogan. And under his supervision, I poured it, but this time with a very non-toxic industrial epoxy that I've been working with on many projects for many years. Polyester resin that has been well documented as being extremely toxic and very dangerous. I began to search for something that had this kind of transparency and experimented with a number of epoxies. Eventually I found a company that I'm working with now that makes a very clear material that is not easy to use, but it is tolerable, and I tested it for 2 or 3 years in direct sunlight. And then I went through a number of experiments where I went to companies that would test all kinds of materials by speeding up time in certain machines, and they tested these materials and found that over 10 years, 20 years, they would probably be stable. I wanted this particular piece to be much thinner at the apex, no more than 1.5 inches, and so he had to find a radius, and then he made a wooden mold that was very thin, and over that they poured silicone rubber. And then to stabilize the silicone rubber, there was a plaster mold poured over that. And so when it was transported to my studio, the entire piece, enormously heavy now because we're dealing with plaster over rubber, had to be inverted onto the table where I work, and then I was able to begin pouring. There were some bubbles and imperfections that stuck to the mold, and I had to get those off and get down to the mold where it was perfect, even if it was uneven, and I made small valleys and mountains. Then it was important to get rid of all those so that it would be a very smooth arc all the way around. Museums should have a record on how the piece should be wrapped for storage, how the piece should be mounted for exhibition, the ideal exhibition space in terms of length, width, and height, and most importantly, how the lights should relate to the piece. I mean, I think that it's best to have in writing and possibly a still photograph, travel with the piece to the museum so that they will know this will be the optimal way it can be shown. The person that restores or polishes this work has to be a specialist in the field. If there is a scratch, it's very important to sand the entire surface because it will take down the surface and it will change the lens quality of the surface. So, and aesthetically, you can't just polish out one piece, even if it's a hairline scratch, because there will be differences visually between the polished out part and the other part. So at the end, you can sand and polish out the part, and then you have to repolish the whole piece. I hope that my works will last for a long time. When they're buried in the ground and unearthed like the Tang horses. I mean, I hope they'll last at least that long. No one knows. But the ones that are made out of these plastics, no one knows their longevity. And they may get roughed up on the surfaces and very damaged. But if they're not broken internally, they could be resuscitated and they may last we have no idea how long that they will last.